This program is sponsored by the Business Roundtable. Thanks to tax reform, American businesses have opened doors across our communities, investing in manufacturing, workers, and equipment, spurring millions of new jobs with higher wages and better training, and setting a new record high in corporate taxes paid to the U.S. government. America's businesses open doors. Tell Congress to keep the door of opportunity open. Protect and strengthen tax reform.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM's POTUS.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Thursday, December 12th. I'm Andrew Aldworth, and I'm joined by Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon, and from the White House, RCP White House correspondent Phil Wegman. So President Biden announced today that he is commuting the sentences of around 1,500 people who were released from prison to home confinement during the COVID-19 pandemic. He also pardoned 39 people convicted of nonviolent crimes. This is all, of course, in the wake of his pardoning his own son and speculation about pardons for other policymakers. Carl, what do you make of this pardon spree?
Well, you know, this if Tom was here, and I'll play the role of Tom Bevan. He thinks I'm naive. He's more cynical. That what the president is doing is giving cover to not just a Hunter Biden pardon, but other pardons like that are coming, pardons that have a political dimension to them. Maybe his brother, maybe some Democrats who were, conspired with never-Trumpers to bedevil the president-elect his first time in office and the whole 4 years he was out of office, and to make a contrast maybe to the pardons that he thinks are coming of the J6ers. So, yeah, okay. But the other thing he's doing, and that's all part of it. He's also, I think, trying to cement his legacy here. There were 39 pardons early in the day, and then 1,500 commutations of people who were in prison too long. I think he's trying to, set a tone that here was a person who had some empathy, who understood, that the criminal justice system can make mistakes, or that even when it doesn't make a mistake, that people are confined for too long a period of time. And I think it's part of an idea to create an overall vibe when he leaves office, that people remember him in a better way than they may have if they just thought about the debate or Kamala Harris's loss or some of the missteps.
Yeah, well, Carl, you did a pretty good job of trying to channel Tom Bevan there, but you reverted to form. There's a very kind way to look at it. Phil, you're over at the White House. What are they saying about it? Because I think there are people who are thinking he's just trying to flood the zone here. He gets so many pardons that people will sort of, ignore the ones that come later, or like they won't seem as strange as they might otherwise.
We're still making our way through the list of all of the folks who got pardons and commutations to see if there's any political angle here, or if there's some patronage from President Biden on his way out the door. Certainly the White House, they want to focus on the empathy here, on the grace at, the holiday season. But let's face it, I think the cynical take might just be the right one. This is an attempt to put an asterisk on the very historic pardon, which is of his son, Hunter Biden, someone who the president said he would not pardon, and then he turned around and did just that.
Yeah, well, Carl, there's we're talking about his legacy, the Biden legacy, a lot lately. There's this New York Times article today. We ran it on the front page of RCP, and it says in part, the immigration surge of the past few years has been the largest in U.S. history, surpassing the great immigration boom of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Total net migration during the Biden administration is likely to exceed 8 million people. That's going to be a big part of his legacy, don't you think?
Sure. And Donald Trump had addressed this the first time he ran when he's president. He had this policy, remain in Mexico, that Democrats criticized all during the presidential primary season. Every Democrat criticized, including Joe Biden. Biden didn't go as far as some of the others. They basically said in the primary season, open amnesty, an open border. Biden didn't do that. He didn't say that. He kind of did it. And, again, a cynical person or conservative might look at this New York Times story, by the way, which is by, one of their really best reporters, David Leonhardt, and say, oh, now you tell us, now you admit it. Now you admit the border was broken. Now you,
Yeah.
But again, it seems to come full circle. Phil's at the White House today. I remember there was a White House press conference when Biden was first elected. And I think it was Yamisha Alcindor asked him a question, basically, are people coming to this country because, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, because they know you're a nice guy, because they know you're a decent guy. Well, yeah, partly. I mean, there's other words for it, but they knew the border was open. They knew that the United States policies had changed, and that even people with violent crimes on their record would be allowed to come in and given a citation and said they have to, show up at court, sometime in the future. So yeah, the word went out, and that's part of Biden's legacy too. But again, it's of a piece with these commutations. I think he's trying to send a message, big-hearted message.
Phil, were you struck by the New York Times article? Because it did seem sort of like a now you tell us kind of article from the New York Times.
I'll leave the media criticism to others. I'm certainly no one's assignment editor, but I was struck by just how very tone deaf the Biden, then the Harris campaign's message on immigration was in light of this surge that the New York Times reported. Clearly, they misread the political situation, and they seemed to look past the humanitarian crisis occurring on the border. They didn't have a response to it other than to blame the previous administration. Just anecdotally here, I remember one of the very first questions that I asked President Biden was not at a press conference, but at remarks that he was making. And I shouted out and I asked him, is there a crisis at the border, sir? He replied, no, we can handle it, God willing. And this White House didn't call that deluge coming across the southern border a crisis until the final year, when they were seeking to negotiate sort of an 11th hour compromise with Republicans. This is not something that has been front and center. It's been something that they've looked past.
Yeah. Well, and Andy, those 8 million people, they flooded these cities. They overwhelmed the social services. Previously in the United States, the policy was, if you come here, if you have papers and you're lying, the idea was you had to attest that you wouldn't be a drain on the social services of the country. You had to swear to it. These people came surging across the border, and the same thing happened in Europe. It's happened somewhat in Australia. It's happened around the world, which is not only do they not say they won't be a strain on the social resources, they've had demonstrations which they've demanded free housing.
Right.
and these sanctuary cities have granted it. And I think we all think it's one of the reasons Donald Trump won the election.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the FBI for a second. FBI Director Chris Wray announced today, or maybe last night, that he will resign at the end of the Biden administration. He said this is the best way to avoid dragging the Bureau deeper into the fray while reinforcing the values and principles that are so important to how we do our work. So, Phil, what do you make of Christopher Wray stepping aside?
Well, he's stepping aside early. He had a 10-year term, and he could have ridden this out until Inauguration Day, sort of forcing the incoming president-elect to fire him. Instead, he didn't do that. It's easy to identify a lot of the Republican and sort of MAGA grievances against the man who Donald Trump made FBI director, the man who he appointed after he fired James Comey. There's the raid on Mar-a-Lago, the continued investigation of January 6th protesters. Those are the things that get in the craw of the right. But if you compare Christopher Wray and President-elect Trump's incoming FBI director nominee, Kash Patel, the one thing that you can say about the difference between the two guys is Kash Patel's very loyal to Donald Trump above all else. And it seemed that Christopher Wray, love him or hate him, he saw his allegiances as elsewhere and beyond just the man.
Well, Andy, the FBI director is not supposed to be personally loyal to the president. That's kind of an idea that comes up from time to time and gets rejected in the course of human events. But in this case, Christopher Wray took over an agency at Donald Trump's request that had become politicized, and he vowed not to do that. But something else had gone on. And that is that the FBI had morphed over time from a crime-fighting organization into one that was concerned unduly in the minds of some with domestic terrorism. And that slopped into the Biden administration into other areas like And even as early, and even while Trump was president, into stifling free speech, into infiltrating Twitter and making demands of Twitter, and going for quote disinformation, for things they didn't like, for investigating Catholic, ardently conservative pro-life Catholics, for calling them terrorists, basically, for demonstrating at abortion clinics. And I think what Kash Patel, it's hard to know because he says a lot of things, but I think what he's talking about is maybe getting this agency back to its roots of fighting crime, and less like spying on Americans. And Phil says that the right has been aggrieved by this, but you and I are old enough to know that when that was a liberal issue.
People have sort of switched teams on this one. But Phil, I did want to ask you, because Trump responded to this on Truth Social, and he said, we will now restore the rule of law for all Americans. So, in your view, is this a restoration of a less political FBI? Or, as critics say, and we mentioned Kash Patel, who's his nominee to head the FBI, he's just putting his own guy in place, and he's just politicized. It'll be just as politicized, but only from a different direction.
In their mind, they certainly see this as a restoration. You hear from both President-elect and his family that they love the door kickers at the FBI. They just don't like the leadership. And their hope is that if they can put in someone who is really dedicated to the mission, that perhaps they can clean out the rot. That's the argument that they make publicly. I think Kash Patel, with his list of enemies, which he has made public, list of folks who are opposed to the incoming president-elect, it's going to raise some serious questions about just how nonpartisan he can actually be, and we'll see. We'll see what the Senate has to say.
Yeah, well, we will see. Anyway, interesting stuff. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil Wegman and Carl Cannon. We're going to take a break and be back right after this.
This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
This program is sponsored by the Business Roundtable. Thanks to tax reform, American businesses have opened doors across our communities, investing in manufacturing, workers, and equipment, spurring millions of new jobs with higher wages and better training, and setting a new record high in corporate taxes paid to the U.S. government. America's businesses open doors. Tell Congress to keep the door of opportunity open. Protect and strengthen tax reform.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics with Andrew Walworth. You're listening to Sirius XM's POTUS, Channel 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm here with Phil Wegman and Carl Cannon. Phil is at the White House. There is, guys, a new nominee to head the Voice of America. Trump has said he wants Kari Lake to head the government's news agency. It's a pretty big broadcasting job, $300 million budget, more than 2,000 employees, a weekly audience of 326 million. So, Carl, what do you make of Kari Lake as head of the VOA?
Well, my philosophy in life is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that agency had the perfect person to head it already. His name is Mike Abramowitz. He's a person I've known a long time. He was veteran Washington Post reporter, directed coverage as an editor that won a Pulitzer Prize. That probably doesn't cut much ice with Donald Trump. But then he was president of Freedom House and is one of the most articulate and empathetic and powerful voices for human rights around the world that this country has to offer. I don't want to prejudge Kari Lake. She's said a lot of outrageous things while running for office in Arizona, but elective politics can be performative art, and I hope she'll do well in the job. But I want to say this is not a job the president in modern times usually picks himself. He picks the person who's overall the board of governors head, like Michael Pack was and Amanda Bennett is now. People expected, Michael Pack in their mind got a raw deal because his nomination was held up for a couple of years on kind of phony ethics grounds by Bob Menendez of all people.
Right,
so
Senator Menendez, who is not a paragon of ethnicity.
So I get that, but this job, it seems to me you could have picked your own person to head the entire the State Department job, the Senate confirmable job, and left Michael Abramowitz in place, that would have been, to me, made a lot more sense. But Donald Trump didn't consult me.
Well, I did talk to a few people who know a little bit about public diplomacy in preparation for this interview. And I will tell you, the headline is Heads Are Exploding. This is not a popular pick among the sort of people who have professionalized public diplomacy. And Phil, the rules are that the U.S. Agency of Global Media, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but that's the body that oversees the Voice of America, and that they do the hiring and firing. It isn't something that the president gets to nominate. So I guess the next step is he's got to name people to that to the board. But Kari Lake, she's a pretty. It's just one more of these Trump picks that, like I said, is making people's heads inside the Beltway explode.
I think this is the step that you would take just short of abolishing that agency. Kari Lake's defining characteristic has been her antipathy for the media, and we've seen Republicans really use this back and forth with the press to their advantage. They argue that if they're getting flack from reporters, that they must be over the target. Kari Lake has perfected this, short of what Donald Trump has done himself. I would be very curious, though, to hear the interview process between the Board of Governors and Ms. Lake. We'll see if she can get confirmed. But this is an example of Donald Trump. He has a very unitary view of the executive, and he doesn't like a lot of internal barriers. So this will be just another example, I think, of some of the speed bumps internally, and we'll learn something from this entire process.
Yeah. Look, Phil makes a point, and Donald Trump ran as a disruptor, and I don't begrudge him he's following through on this kind of president he said he was going to be. He's not even president yet, but not replacing the Voice of America, the top editor there, the director of that, before you've got the team in place above him. It's like you hired a first base coach before you hired a new manager. It really doesn't even make sense. And I kind of wonder how much Donald Trump even knows about how that operation works.
Well, I mean, most presidents don't know much about how the VOA operates. I think Ronald Reagan might have been the last guy who really understood it because it was in his bones. But it's a 7-person board, 4 people, and it's got to be a 4-3 split, I think, between the Democrats and Republicans, depending on who has the White House. So yeah, it'll be a process. And if one thing we learned the last time around, they're pretty good at slowing these things down. So how long Kari Lake has to wait before she actually gets to take over will be a pretty interesting question. And I do think that question of whether this, as Phil says, shows that you're just trying to zero out a lot of the sort of public diplomacy efforts. Now, to her credit, you have to say, she is an experienced broadcaster. She does know something about the media, and so she does have that going for her. But guys, I want to talk about some other news today that just you couldn't ignore. Meta, that's the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. They announced a gift of $1 million to the Trump inaugural, largely viewed as Mark Zuckerberg signaling that he wants to work closely with the Trump administration. And Phil, the inaugural is about as swampy as things get in Washington. There's lots of parties. There's big contributions. Should we be shocked at this, or is this just business as usual within the Beltway?
$1 million from Meta is not going to change things significantly. Donald Trump likes his big tech tycoons in a single flavor, and that is adoration, right? I'm not sure what Mark Zuckerberg can do to compete with Elon Musk at this point, but that's not to say that Republicans are not grateful when it comes to dollars and cents. I doubt that they're going to be impressed with $1 million for the inauguration. They will, however, be impressed with the fact that this time around, Mark Zuckerberg did not spend as much in the general election. There's a considerable amount of consternation over his, get out the vote efforts in 2020. Conservatives argue that those weren't actually just sort of good government efforts to get folks to the polls, but instead that it favored, liberal and Democratic voters. And so I think that, the big gift if you will, was what did not occur in November, not what's going to occur come January.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it was about $420 million that Zuckerberg and his wife, through their foundation, spent on Get Out the Vote.
I had a slightly less serious reaction, a less substantive reaction, I should say. I was thinking how far Mark Zuckerberg has come. Remember, he's this character in The Social Network. He's such a jerk. He can't go on a date without offending his girlfriend.
That was a movie, but go ahead. Yeah.
Breaking up with, I know, but that was most Americans' introduction to him. I'm sure he objected to the portrayal. He's kind of, this character is kind of on the spectrum and so rude. And now I'm thinking, does he want to go to the inaugural ball? Is Mark Zuckerberg evolved now so that we're going to see him in a tuxedo?
Well,
$1 million will get you invited to the best inaugural ball.
That's true. And, Carl, you and I have talked about this before, but the evolution of the tech industry from being a place that sort of held Washington at arm's length and thought that, that was the old way of doing things. They were going to reinvent the world. They were different. And here they are. They are, like I said, about as swampy as you can get there.
Andy, when I got
to lobbying than anybody else, right?
When I got to Washington, as far as I know, there was one person from the Silicon Valley who lobbied. His name was Ken Hagerty. He was a good source of mine. He was a moderate Republican, and we would go to lunch from time to time, and we would talk about what high tech wants, and it was what Ken Hagerty thought they wanted. Yeah. And those guys, they thought government has nothing to offer us. Now they took government grants. We know now more. They were at the government teat more than they acknowledged, or even to themselves. But yeah, it's a lot different now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to leave you guys with a quote. This is Casey Burgett. I hope I have her name right, or his name. I don't even know. But it was I think it was in USA Today. He's at GW University. And he said of this donation, quote, "It doesn't buy you a way into the room, but as the calculus of these on a lot of these companies is that it is a necessary precondition to be invited into policy discussions." So $1 million doesn't really buy you much in Washington anymore. Phil, what do you think?
I think that this is very much par for the course. We see any number of industries again and again donating to both the Republican and the Democrat. I think that the author of that quote is correct. This is just the price of doing business in Washington, D.C., and that is unfortunate. It's not a meritocracy. It's not often even a discussion of what is the best way forward. It's who can get to the table and stay there, realizing that if you're not at the table, you're on it.
Yeah, well, good point. Hey, I want to thank you both for being here, and I want to thank you guys for channeling Tom Bevan's cynicism. We kind of missed that around here. Hopefully he'll be back with us tomorrow. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Carl Cannon and Phil Wegman. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM right after this.
This is Real Clear Politics with Andrew Walworth on Sirius XM.
Informed viewpoints spanning the ideological spectrum.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM Channel 124.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of RCP, and you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM POTUS channel, or maybe listening and watching on our podcast. Anyway, I'm glad to welcome now Stephen Ross Pomeroy, who's the editor of Real Clear Science. Don't tell Tom Bevan this, but it's probably my favorite vertical that we have. Welcome, Ross.
Much appreciated, Carl. Happy to be here.
So, we've got this, it's an interesting development in the intersection between science and politics. Jay Bhattacharya, a Stanford professor who we gave the Samostat Prize to last year, is replacing his nemesis, Francis Collins, at NIH if President-elect Trump gets his way. And I know both these guys. I know Francis really well. I know Jay. I like them both. They're both the most unusual, deeply sourced, impeccable scientific credentials. They also happen to be practicing Christians. But Francis kind of went after Dr. J during COVID, and now he's taking his job. And we've talked about that on the show, that it's almost a soap opera dimension and a human drama. But looking ahead, Ross, what are we likely to see changes at NIH in the National Institutes of Health, and which has this huge research budget. What, as a science writer, what are you looking for if Jay is confirmed a change of direction, if any?
Yeah, and in the past, Jay has made a lot of statements to this effect. A lot of big changes potentially coming to NIH. Most broadly, just recently in his tweet, he said he was humbled to be nominated by Trump. He said, "We will reform American scientific institutions so that they are worthy of trust again." And obviously, their trust has been eroded pretty heavily in the wake of the COVID pandemic.
So what is that? How does that translate into policy differences or differences in priority or emphasis or spending, as you see it? I mean, I know I'm asking you to project ahead, but what do you be looking for in terms of how that ethos translates into policy?
Yeah, and I'll tell you what's interesting about Dr. J is that he got his big name by being a quote unquote COVID lockdown denier, and getting castigated by a lot of people on the left for that stuff. But before, he's a health economist, and he's actually written about NIH practices pretty copiously in the past. He's participated in NIH review panels, so he's pretty knowledgeable about how the NIH works. In a 2018 working paper, for example, he wrote that the NIH could do more to promote innovative science, arguing that scientific and political considerations have led the agency to inadequately fund exploration into new ideas. He has also written that scientific breakthroughs has stagnated because scientists were wrongly focused on just simply being cited by other researchers. In short, he thinks that the NIH has really lost its way by really becoming a part of the sort of publisher perish business focused aspect of academia, where the business of academia and science has just become to get grants from the NIH.
Well, you know what's interesting, Russ, is I hear you talk about this. I'm reminded of President Biden's moonshot to cure cancer, which when he announced when he was vice president. We haven't heard a lot about it recently, but moonshot was a fascinating metaphor because it reminded me, people my age, of John F. Kennedy's wanting President Kennedy committing Americans to go to the moon. He didn't live to see it, but his promise was fulfilled. We did it by the end of the decade being the 60s. But there's a thought, in NASA, certainly in NIH, in big government programs, that the pioneering, the new frontier spirit finally succumbs to bureaucratic norms and bureaucratic realities. Does Jay Bhattacharya, is he a person who can inject NIH with the kind of spirit that President Biden himself was talking about when he just said, we got to cure cancer and, we'll figure it out, and just sort of committed, but suggesting that, research, we're going to find new ideas. We're going to find new things. We're going to go in new ways.
I think he really can. Again, he's written on this in the past, and even in interviews has said something to that effect. He wants to restructure the NIH, quote, so there's more centers of power. So it's not just scientific bureaucrats that have just been there for decades making decisions. For example, one thing in science that's always said is science only advances with funerals. And that's because people who have been entrenched in academia and honestly really the ones that get all this NIH grant money are the ones who get all the money. Their ideas get credence and get all the attention. I think Jay is going to try and really go into that agency and really break apart the influence that's just been restricted to, like you said, a few scientific bureaucrats.
When COVID came, I spoke about it. I wrote about it for Real Clear Politics and talked about it on our podcast. Then we had our early podcast. Tony Fauci to me was what I thought initially perfectly positioned. I'd covered him. I'd covered the AIDS crisis, and he had been innovative. He himself had bucked the establishment. He'd been empathetic towards the sufferers of AIDS. They were hard to win over. They hung him in effigy and ended up having dinner parties at his house, and he really listened. And I thought he was the right guy. But by the time COVID hit, he was 80. He was 80 years old, or almost 80, entrenched. He wasn't the same guy. He didn't bring the same sort of the same creativity to looking at this new virus that he did at the other one. And I ended up being, disillusioned a bit. What were your thoughts about Dr. Fauci?
Well, he's sort of a stubborn guy. I'm sure you probably realized that from all his interviews. But I mean, he's also very knowledgeable, and he had a way of doing things. And one thing we should be clear about too is that it wasn't like he was on an island with his beliefs. I mean, a lot of other researchers and academics and public health officials were basically saying the same things that he was saying about COVID. And it was a tough time too. I mean, we were in the middle of a pandemic, the likes of which we hadn't seen for 100 years. And I think a lot of, especially people in Dr. Fauci's position, really wanted to be more cautious. And maybe that caution, as we're learning now, was a little too much to the detriment or a little overboard.
You're listening to Stephen Ross Pomeroy, editor of Real Clear Science. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for RCP. Ross, let me ask you about another guy who's been in the news. He's very different than Jay Bhattacharya, who's humble and sweet. He's an acquired taste, let's say. I'm talking about Bobby Kennedy Jr., who, I'm reminded of the old description of Winston Churchill. He's a bull who carries his own china closet with him. But at HHS, I thought some job, but maybe even attorney general, which his father had. But no, he wanted HHS. He got it. People over there, the establishment is worried. What are you looking for in a change of direction at that agency if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is confirmed?
And to your point, he's got a lot of big plans, but he's going to have to be approved first. And right now, Trump's defense nominee, Mr. Hegseth, is getting all the attention, and a lot of the press is saying he's going to have a difficult time getting through. But RFK Jr. is also going to have a lot of trouble getting through, and that's something that's not getting covered right now. But it's going to be a difficult road for him, I think.
What are the things he said that are most troubling to people in the Senate, would you say?
Yeah, let's be clear too. He's also said some pretty reasonable things. Let's start off with those. So he wants to remove ultra processed foods from school lunches. Hard to find a disagreement there. Ultra processed foods is probably not good for our kids to be eating in such great quantities. Called for banning hundreds of food additives and chemicals such as food dyes. These are chemicals which have actually been disallowed in Canada and the EU. Pretty reasonable, actually. A great demonstration of that you can see if you look at Canadian Fruit Loops. Their colors are a little duller, but they also don't have those artificial food dyes that are present in the Fruit Loops.
Maybe he'll get some Democrats to support him then. All right, we got about a minute left. All right, but what are the things that are going to cause him problems?
Yeah, so one of the big things is obviously he wants to remove fluoride from drinking water. Says he'll do that on day one. Right now, there's about 3 drops of fluoride, the equivalent of 3 drops of fluoride per this would be in that 55-gallon barrel for our drinking water. That helps get rid of cavities, especially in poor populations that don't have access to toothbrushing and fluoride toothpaste. But of course, the biggest one is vaccines. He's made many false claims in the past that vaccines are linked to autism. In 2019, he went to Samoa and spoke to a lot of officials there about problems with the vaccines. And there was subsequently a large measles outbreak there where 83 people died. What he says there is he doesn't want to take away vaccines from people who want them, but it's very possible he can make it much easier to get exceptions for vaccines, which would obviously lower uptake.
Is he going to have to back off those statements a little bit to be confirmed? Would you say 30 seconds?
I think he definitely will, but I'm not sure. I think he will need to back up those statements, but I'm not sure if he will. He's been a hard-headed reformer, quote, for years, and it's going to be tough to get him off those positions. And of course, he has a way of sort of sanitizing the bit. He says he's not anti-vaccine, and that obviously anybody who wants a vaccine will be able to get them, which is, again, like I said, it's definitely going to be true, but he's probably going to make the exceptions. People who don't want vaccines much easier to get, which could endanger herd immunity in the United States.
Well, that phrase you used, Ross, hard-headed reformer, they seem to go together. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to turn it over now to Andy Walworth, who's going to be talking in our next segment to Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
This is Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM.
This program is sponsored by the Business Roundtable. Thanks to tax reform, American businesses have opened doors across our communities, investing in manufacturing, workers, and equipment, spurring millions of new jobs with higher wages and better training, and setting a new record high in corporate taxes paid to the U.S. government. America's businesses open doors. Tell Congress to keep the door of opportunity open. Protect and strengthen tax reform.
Honest reporting and an authentic picture of public disclosure. This is Real Clear Politics on POTUS, Sirius XM 124.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. My next guest is William Galston. He's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So, Bill, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
Bill, so I wanted to have you on today to talk about your piece in the Journal earlier this week defending the National Endowment for Democracy, in part because last week we interviewed someone who has emerged as a major critic of NED, as it's called, and that's Jim Pearson. Apparently, NED is in the crosshairs of Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, but you think it deserves to live on. What's the argument for continuing NED funding?
It's very simple. No organization on earth has done more to promote and defend freedom over the past 4 decades than the National Endowment for Democracy. And just to get one, bad argument out of the way quickly, NED was not founded simply as an anti-Soviet or anti-communist entity. It is a pro-freedom entity. And the threats to freedom did not end when the Soviet Union went away.
So, as you say, it was founded, I guess, in about 1983, correct? It was sort of a Reagan-era initiative and was really regarded at the time as sort of an important step in fighting communism through ideas. But when we talk about promoting democracy, that's a little different. What's the difference in your mind between fighting communism with ideas and promoting freedom with ideas?
Well, promoting freedom was the National Endowment for Democracy's way of opposing communism on the terrain of ideas, but not only that, putting money in the form of small grants in the hands of people who shared this passion for democracy in countries around the world, including countries that were only partially democratic or ruled by autocrats and dictators. So the strategy was to empower the ideas that NED was founded to promote. And it has been, I'm not a neutral here. I served on NED's board for 9 years, and I made that very clear when I wrote my Wall Street Journal piece. But I was involved in reviewing thousands and thousands of grants on an annual basis, and you can't take a fair-minded look at what NED was doing without being impressed by the breadth of their effort, the integrity of the grant-making process, and the quality of the results. And you can in a portfolio that big, you can always pick out a few bad apples, but they did not spoil the barrel.
So talking about bad apples, I mean, they've gotten a lot of criticism for that funding. They gave $230,000 to the Global Disinformation Index. It's a British nonprofit. What the GDI does is they compile a list of websites that they accuse of peddling disinformation. Then major advertising companies use that to blacklist American news organizations identified by GDI, or at least that's the accusation. I think the State Department got sued over this, and I should say that Real Clear ended up on this list because we aggregate articles from a lot of different sources. So inevitably, you want to talk about bad apples. I mean, inevitably, we're linking to all sorts of different types of stories. But I mean, what do you make of that? People think that that was really an overreach and also sort of was a way that the State Department got involved in domestic politics in a way that I don't think anyone would condone.
Look, that grant was a mistake. And it's my understanding, subject to correction, that when these arguments were presented to the National Endowment for Democracy. They acknowledged it had been a mistake and terminated the grant. And I am not defending that specific decision, but I am asking fair-minded listeners and viewers to put that in the context of more than 2,000 other grants the National Endowment made that year.
So I guess the other argument, and people should go back and listen to the interview with Jim Pearson. Really interesting to have these two interviews side by side. So I appreciate you coming on to do this. That the people, or at least the staff at this point, are not only, because they are pro-democracy or anti-authoritarian, some of them have identified Trump as being an authoritarian figure, and thus, again, have sort of crossed over into becoming a critique of American domestic politics as well as what's going on overseas.
It is always possible to cherry pick staff, as it is possible to cherry pick grants. Mr. Pearson, among other things, picked out a couple of members of the board, including Ann Applebaum, whose pronouncements on autocracy and populism and nationalism he didn't particularly like. He went on to charge that those opinions had become integrated into the official charter of the NED, which is flat out false. The official charter has not changed, and there is no evidence that this perspective, which is no doubt shared by some members of the staff as well as some members of the NED board, has actually made its way into NED's activities. And so once again, the argument from particular examples to general conclusions is, in my mind, completely unpersuasive.
And I'm sort of curious as to why they're sort of focused on zeroing out the budget. And Trump has done this before. I mean, back in, I think, 2018, he tried to cut NED's budget. NED gives a lot of grants to sort of four different groups: a labor group, a business group, and two others. You probably could tell us.
There's a National Democratic Institute,
right,
which is
two
Democratic
parties, right,
oriented, and a Republican Democratic Institute, which is Republican oriented. Look, let me tell you what I think is really behind all of this.
Please do.
A central figure in this debate about national conservatism, populism, et cetera, is Viktor Orban.
Oh, okay.
And as I recall, Mr. Pearson made a reference to Viktor Orban. So,
tell our viewers who Viktor Orban is.
Viktor
really
Orban is the Prime Minister of Hungary, and he has sponsored and carried out a program of what he calls illiberal democracy. In the phrase liberal democracy, the liberal doesn't refer to the antonym of conservative. It refers to a body of institutions and guarantees for individuals, for minority groups, for people who want to peacefully assemble to petition their government for redress of their grievances, et cetera. All of the guarantees that are included in the Bill of Rights, as well as in our basic constitutional architecture, to prevent tyranny coming from any source, including the tyranny of the majority. Viktor Orban rejects that. He thinks it's just fine for the government of Hungary to own outright or through intermediaries 90% of Hungary's media. He thinks it's just fine to reduce the independence of the judiciary. He thinks it's just fine to send into exile an entire university whose orientation he did not like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the populist nationalist movement thinks that Budapest is the new Rome and Viktor Orban is its pope. And fair-minded observers like Freedom House have documented the damage that Viktor Orban has done to both freedom and democracy since he's become the unchallenged leader of Hungary. And nationalists and populists reject that critique, even though it's factual.
Well, so in your view, then, this really comes down to sort of a foreign policy difference over how to treat Hungary.
But Hungary is, what the grammarians call a synecdoche. That is, it stands for a way of thinking about democracy that is hostile to the restraints on the power of the majority that liberal democracy believes is fundamental. I take Viktor Orban at his word. He is an illiberal Democrat. He believes in majorities, largely because he gets them so regularly. He does not believe in restraints on his majority.
And so we got about a minute left here, Bill, and I'm talking to Bill Galston. He has written this very interesting piece, it's on our front page today. As a matter of fact, it's on this National Endowment of Democracy question. What do you think is going to happen?
I have no idea. I really have no idea. I hope that the many friends on both sides of the aisle that Ned has developed over the past 40 years will come to its defense in its hour of maximum peril. Whether that will be enough, I don't know.
Could it continue if government funding was cut? Because it's a non-government organization, it has its own board. True, but right now it receives about $300 million a year. Right.
There's no way that I think private contributions could replace more than a small fraction of that. And it would be the end of the National Endowment for Democracy as we now know it.
Well, Bill, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for being here. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I've been talking to Bill Galston of the Wall Street Journal and the Brookings Institution. I'm Andrew Walworth. We'll be back here tomorrow. Have a great evening.
The
Politics
of
the
United States.
This is POTUS on Sirius XM Channel 124.